We're on our way over to Garagemahall again to work on the backdrop again. Last time we were over there working on trees, adding trees into the backdrop. This time we're going to be adding buildings to the backdrop, and this is something you see done a lot, is people who want to put buildings on their backdrop. We talked when we were at Steve's house about how Steve paints buildings on the backdrop. But some people will actually put like flat buildings like we did with the trees, flat buildings onto the backdrop. So we're going to investigate the ins and outs and problems and challenges, because they are many. And we will be looking at how you do building flats or buildings on your backdrop. So check this out. Well, 2 weeks ago, we had Robbie Spangler over to Garagemahall, and if you recall, he was showing us how to add trees to the backdrop, and that was pretty cool. But we want to add some buildings to the backdrop. In this case, this is just a regular building, and it certainly isn't on the backdrop. It's a fully three-dimensional building. But sometimes you want to fake a building, making it look like there's a building in the background, by adding an actual building front to the backdrop. Problem is, it looks like you stuck a building front to the backdrop. You can tell that there's no substance to this, that it's just a wall stuck to the backdrop. It looks a bit better when you're looking straight at it, but when you get over to one side, then it really looks like you just stuck a building front to the backdrop. Some people will try to solve this problem by painting the side of the building on here, but it would only work from one angle. Now, about the only place I want to use a building flat is here at the very end of the yard. I'm going to put a building against the paint booth to hide the paint booth, and that will cascade around the corner. So if I put the building wall here again, it just looks like I stuck a building wall to the side of the paint booth. So I need to do something that looks more like a building and less like just a wall. Over on the backdrop side, I'm going to use this tall fence and a walkway above as a sort of building flat, but that's okay if it looks flat because, hey, it's a fence, it's supposed to look flat. But the best way to disguise the building is to build a building that actually has a little bit of depth to it. Doesn't have to be a full building, but if it sticks out a few inches from the paint booth, it will look like a building, not just a wall. This is actually something that was made by Mountains in Minutes, and it looks pretty good there, but I want to scratch build something, in part because this thing is just too small for what I want to do here, and because scratch building is fun. And that way I can also incorporate my walkways, and I want to use great big windows so you can see inside because I want to do an interior. So I'm using Lightwave software again to test what I want to do. Here I've put in the overhead walkway and the fence. You can see the end of the paint booth there, and that's where I want to stick in my building. So here's the building that I've designed with great big windows, sticks out just a few inches from the paint booth, and I've got all my walkways and railings and everything there. But it still looks sort of like a building flat, not like an actual building. So I want to stick a mirror on the end of the paint booth that will make the building twice as deep, make the walkways bigger, and reflect the backdrop way off into space. It's actually really magic what happens when you place a mirror perpendicular to your backdrop this way. It just extends the whole railroad way off into the distance. And you can see right through the windows of the building, seeing the yard in the distance, plus the interior when I build it will be twice as big as whatever I build because of the mirror. So I plan on putting an ammonia compressor in here. I'll end up with 2 ammonia compressors because of the mirror. Twice as much modeling for the same amount of work. In fact, everything gets doubled. The lighting, the figures, everything I put in there will be doubled. But my real motivation was to make a flat building appear to be a 3-dimensional freestanding building, and it just works, doesn't it? I'm also going to make one side of my compressor green and the other side red so that the 2 compressors appear to be a red and green compressor. Now here's another workaround to avoid a building flat. This is a diagonal building, this one on about a 45-degree angle. It sticks out into the layout and it may occupy more space than you want it to, but you can't tell that it's a building flat because it's not. And if you move off to one side, all of your perspectives still look absolutely correct. There's no way of telling with a building like this that the other two walls are simply missing. No matter what angle you look at it from, it looks just fine. Now, real estate along the backdrop tends to be very precious. Your tracks tend to get right up next to the backdrop, so you may not be able to stick the building out very far, but any amount of depth is going to help. And placing the building at an angle really helps. If you remember on Steve's backdrop, he painted his buildings on also at an angle, a 30 to 45 degree angle. It helps fool the eye into thinking that they're three-dimensional. It works with both a completely flat building like that or a modeled front like this. And where space is precious, at least at one side of the building, you can get your tracks right up against the backdrop. And you could place a building flat in that area, and at least on one side of that building flat, you can't tell that it's flat because it's disguised by the angled building. So you could put an angled building to the right of this, and there'd be no way of knowing that the building in the center is absolutely flat. So let's mess with that in software. I whipped up an absolutely flat building here and stuck it against the backdrop. From this angle, it doesn't look that bad because we're close to the building and right square in front of it. But again, as we get off to one side, oops, it's just absolutely a flat wall. The fence disguises the very bottom part of it, but what about the rest of the building? Instead of an angled building, what other elements might we be able to stick in there to hide the fact that there's no side on this building? We could make the fence incredibly tall, but that wouldn't look very good, would it? We could put another flat building in there. At least that moves the problem down some distance, and we may be able to just cascade the problem all the way down to the corner of the layout or up against some object where we can hide the fact that it's a building flat. Or when we get to the end of our row of buildings, there's our old friend, the angled building, and we could just stick an angled building in there. In this case, I've put an angled building on one side of the flat and a really, really tall fence on the other side. And other than the fact that the fence is kind of corny, it actually looks pretty good. But there are some other things that we could stick in here besides angled buildings and fences to hide the edge of the building. Now, a couple of weeks ago, we were messing around with trees on the backdrop, and one of the things we looked at is a half tree, a flat tree that just sticks to the backdrop. The neat thing here is it doesn't really occupy a lot of real estate because down where the trains are, all that's there is the trunk of the tree. The branches can hang out into the space above the trains, and that means you can get your tracks right up against the backdrop. And if the tree is dense enough, it will hide the edge of the building. To help this effect out, you can paint tree in that area and then put your three-dimensional tree over that, and that way it really looks like there's tree all the way back there and not some space behind the building flat. I haven't done that, and so you can actually see right through the tree at the top of the fence, and that doesn't look so good. And of course, we can still add more building flats from this point down, and that looks pretty darn good. You'd never guess that these are building flats. At the far end of the row of buildings, you could have more trees or an angled building, whatever element you want to come up with to disguise the other end of the row of buildings. And half-round elements can also work on the backdrop. In this case, we have an exactly 1/2 round water tank. The problem with this is you can see where the water tank is attached to the backdrop, and it betrays the fact that this is just a half-round flat element. But if we scoot it out just a little bit so that you can't see where it's hooked to the backdrop, there's no way of knowing that this isn't actually round. It looks like a freestanding element, even though it's hooked to the backdrop. The distance that you have to move it out depends on your angle of view. If the viewer can't move very far to the left or right, then you don't need to move it out very far at all. However, if people can move way off to the left or way off to the right, you may have to move it quite far out. The key is you don't want to be able to see that it's attached to the backdrop. So this is yet another way to hide the edge of a building so that you can use absolutely flat building fronts and not tell that they're actually flat building fronts stuck to the backdrop. So it entirely depends on what you have space for, exactly what you can fit in, and what your likes and dislikes are in terms of using flat buildings or vegetation, or just what you want to use on your backdrop. So I'm really anxious to get to work on the ice house that'll go here at the end of the yard. First, we have to finish up the rest of the backdrop painting, and I want to get my mirror into position and, of course, finish my fence. But then I'll be able to go to work on my ice house with the large windows and the full interior, knowing that all of that will be doubled in the mirror, and it should just look great. Well, there you go, putting buildings on the backdrop. And I think we've all seen buildings on backdrops that didn't really work very well. And we've seen buildings on backdrops that worked brilliantly. And how and why, and even with all of the tips and tricks and investigations that we've done here in the show, it still may not mean a darn thing till you actually try it.
Right.
But it's kind of a tricky thing, getting buildings to look right that are just flat buildings on your backdrop when the rest of your railroad is three-dimensional. There's just a trick to making that look really, really good. Well, hopefully we've moved one giant step closer into making that look really, really good. If you haven't been over to the channel, do pop over to the channel. And if you're not a subscriber to the channel, you want to become a subscriber to the channel. And the way you can subscribe to the channel easily is to click on the blue button, which will be appearing momentarily right there. Zoink, see blue button. It says subscribe. If you don't see it, it's probably because your device doesn't support it, or because I screwed it up somehow.
Yeah.
Which happens.
Sometimes.
But if you see it, you can click on it. It'll just take you to the channel if you're a subscriber. If you're not a subscriber, it'll take you to the channel and make you a subscriber all in one fell swoop. Well, we're not sure how you found this movie on the internet. We hope you didn't find it boring. And we will see you here in a few days or a week, something like that, with some more massive screwing around. See you then. Bye-bye.